Willow Gap County, Texas, January 1883. The wind was the only voice left speaking to Jedediah Caraway. Out on his 1,000-acre spread, the silence had turned thick. Not the kind that soothed, but the kind that pressed against a man's ribs until he could hear his own heartbeat echoing in it. Each creak of the cabin, each empty chair across the table, reminded him how long he'd lived without another soul to answer the quiet. Jedediah Caraway had never been the courting kind. At 38, he'd outlived his parents, outridden 3 ranch hands, and outweighted every matchmaker in Willow Gap. He could haggle over cattle weights to the penny, but couldn't string together polite talk worth a nickel. So he treated marriage the way he treated droughts and busted pumps, something to be handled with efficiency and grit. 2 weeks later, the reply arrived. A crisp envelope, a proper hand, resting on his scarred table like a stranger who somehow knew his name. The lamplight caught the seal as though it meant more than paper and ink. Inside was a single sheet. Sarah Ellen Cole, age 29. Passage arranged, arrival to follow. I understand the terms. That last line echoed. I understand the terms. He read it once, then again, until the lamplight guttered low. What kind of woman wrote that without hesitation? What kind of loneliness answered his own so plainly? He slipped the letter into his coat pocket and carried it for days, close to his chest, as though warmth alone might draw an answer from the paper. March 1883. The westbound stage from San Antonio came thundering down the rutted road, wheels kicking up red caliche dust that hung in the air like smoke. Jedediah Caraway waited by the telegraph office, hat in hand, boots sunk ankle-deep in clay. The coach rocked to a halt, horses steaming in the morning chill. When the door swung open, a woman stepped down, a navy wool coat buttoned to her throat, carpetbag clutched tight as armor. Her gaze swept the sun-blasted storefronts, the leaning barn at the edge of town, and the vast, unbroken horizon beyond. Then her eyes found him. Mr. Caraway, he tipped his hat. I'm Sarah Cole. He nodded once, his throat gone dry. Wagon's over there. Supper's waitin'. Best we start before the coyotes do. Before they left town, he led her across the dusty street to the small frame courthouse where the county judge kept his ledgers and correspondence. The man looked up from a stack of papers as they stepped inside, spectacles sliding down his nose. Afternoon, Caraway, he said. Paperwork for that arrangement you telegraphed? Jedediah nodded. Just making it proper. The judge drew a short document across the desk, signed where needed, and passed the pen to Sarah. She read each line carefully before writing her name in a steady hand. The judge sanded the ink, affixed his seal, and gave a polite nod. Well, I reckon you two will have your hands full out there. She met the man's look evenly. We already do. A few minutes later, they stepped back into the bright midday sun. Jedediah folded the paper, slipped it inside his coat, and motioned toward the waiting wagon. They rode in silence. The harness creaked. The wind hissed through mesquite and prairie grass. The land spread before them like an ocean of faded gold under a pale blue sky. By the time they reached the cabin, late afternoon light slanted low across the hills, turning the dust to violet haze. Inside, the stove gave off a humble heat that softened the edges of the day. Jedediah ladled stew into tin bowls. They ate quietly, the scrape of spoons filling the room. It's quiet here, she said finally. He looked up. It's honest. Her eyes flicked around the small, rough-hewn space, the broom leaning by the door, the dust caught in lamplight. Honest'll do just fine, she said softly. But I'll need soap, a good broom, and daylight if I'm to make this livable. Jedediah almost smiled. You'll have what you need. After she disappeared into the back room, he stood by the lamp listening to her faint footsteps cross the floorboards. The house no longer felt empty, but it didn't yet feel familiar either. like the first few words of a letter he hadn't learned to read. The wind rose as night settled, brushing against the shutters like a reminder that the prairie kept its own counsel. Jedediah lingered at the table after clearing the bowls. The lamplight turned low. When Sarah returned from the small back room where she had set down her carpetbag, she had loosened her hair from its pins and smoothed the creases from her coat before hanging it neatly by the door. She sat across from him, hands folded, eyes steady but guarded. It wasn't a courtship they were having, it was a negotiation. "You'll have food, shelter, and my name," he said. "In return, you'll keep the house, cook what you can, and help where needed. I won't ask about what came before, and I won't expect more than we agreed. We'll try it 1 year, then we'll see." Sarah studied him for a moment, the lamplight steady between them. "I didn't come looking for love, Mr. Carraway," she said evenly. "Only a place where I might breathe. That's all I'm offering." She extended her hand across the table. "Then we're agreed." He took it, firm, brief. The shake was a seal, not a welcome. Outside, the wind rattled the boards, a long, low moan like the prairie itself acknowledging what had just been done. When she rose to leave, she said only, "I'll see to breakfast. You'll find flour and beans in the pantry. I'll find my way." As her footsteps faded into the dark hall, Jedediah sat staring at the empty chair she'd left behind. He had spent years avoiding company, and now, for the first time, he couldn't tell whether the sound he heard in the quiet was relief or fear. April 1883. Spring drifted in with dust storms and stubborn patches of green that clung to the prairie like hope refusing to die. Inside the cabin, life settled into rhythm, two strangers tracing the same small orbit without collision. Jedediah rose before dawn, coffee already dark in the pot before the sky took color. His movements were measured, quiet, boots, coat, door latch. An hour later, Sarah stirred, her day beginning with the soft clatter of crockery and the faint scrape of bread dough on the table. She worked steadily, sleeves rolled past the elbow, face flushed by heat from the stove. He came and went with the sunrise, branding calves, mending wire, losing himself in work that left no room for thought. By midday, she hung laundry that snapped in the wind like white flags of surrender. By dusk, he came home trailing dust and weariness. Supper was plain, beans, biscuits, black coffee, but the smell of yeast and soap had begun to edge out the scent of emptiness. Evenings found them on opposite ends of the porch, both facing west. Her slippers dangled just above the step, his boots rested solid on the planks. Between them, the silence thickened, not hollow now, but humming, alive, as if the air itself was learning to breathe differently. Neither spoke of contentment, but both wondered about it. In the dark, Jedediah sometimes heard her turning in the next room, and something in that small sound made the night feel less vast. Sarah, half awake, listened for his steady breath through the wall, and let it calm her heart. The quiet that had once been his enemy was changing shape, no longer a void, but the start of something unnamed. May 1883. The first real thunder of the season rolled in before sundown, dark clouds dragging their shadows low across the plains. The air thickened, electric and uneasy. Jedediah had been mending the south fence when the wind turned sharp and the sky split with light. He'd just started for home when he heard it, the panicked cry of a colt tangled in barbed wire. Rain came hard and sudden. By the time he reached the animal, the world was a blur of mud and lightning. The young sorrel had thrashed itself bloody, eyes wild, sides heaving. Jedediah set his lantern on a fence post, breath fogging, hands working fast. He muttered to calm the horse, but his voice was swallowed by thunder. Then, through the downpour, another figure appeared. Sarah. Her coat clung to her like another skin, hair plastered to her face. She carried a bundle of clean rags and a small can of kerosene for the lantern. "You'll need light," she called, her voice barely rising over the storm. She knelt beside the colt, one hand on its neck, the other steadying the lantern flame. "Talk to him," she said. "He'll settle if he hears you." Jedediah hesitated. He wasn't used to being told what to do. But something in her tone cut through the thunder, and he obeyed. His voice came low and rough, the words themselves meaningless, but the sound carried warmth. The colt's panic slowed, breath evening out until it lay still, trembling but calm. Lightning flared again, bleaching the world to bone white. In that instant he saw her face, eyes steady, mouth firm, rain running down her cheeks like silver threads. For a moment, the storm outside matched the one inside him. When the thunder finally rolled east, the pasture was a churned sea of mud. Jedediah and Sarah stood side by side, soaked to the bone, their hands streaked with blood and rainwater. Neither spoke. The colt rose unsteadily, limped toward shelter. As they turned back toward the cabin, the wind softened behind them, leaving only the faint hiss of rain in the grass. Something unspoken had shifted between them, something that would not be undone. June 1883. After the storm, the air turned sweet again, washed clean. Days stretched long, the sun fierce and gold over the plains. Inside the cabin, a gentler kind of heat began to grow, one made not of weather, but of presence. The change showed itself in small ways first. The house no longer felt like a place for echoes. Sarah's steady hands left quiet order in their wake. Bread cooling on the table, shirts mended and folded, a sprig of prairie sage set by the window to freshen the air. Jedediah noticed, though he never said it aloud. He simply started coming home a little earlier each evening, without quite knowing why. Then one morning, the smell of smoke, thicker than it should have been, rolled through the kitchen. Sarah stood there with a blackened tray, eyes wide, biscuits ruined. She looked from the burnt biscuits to him, and instead of shame she laughed, a bright surprise sound that startled the rafters. "Reckon I'm better at graves than gravy," she said, fanning the air. Jedediah blinked. Then something deep in him loosened. A low chuckle broke out of him, rough but real. It felt strange in his chest, like finding an old tool he hadn't used in years, and realizing it still worked. That evening, he came back from the range and left a handful of wildflowers on the table, small yellow blooms he'd picked from the creek bed, roots still damp. He didn't announce them, didn't need to. When Sarah found them later, she filled a mason jar, added water, and set them by his plate. Supper passed without a word about it. But both of them noticed that the flowers stayed there for days, long after their color had faded. Sometimes affection starts quiet, like a spark no one means to strike. Summer came down hard that year. The air shimmered above the prairie, heavy with heat and grasshoppers. By noon, the wind was too tired to move. Even the horses stood with heads low, flicking their tails in slow surrender. Jedediah and Sarah spent that Sunday near the creek, the one that wound through a stand of cottonwoods beyond the lower pasture. The water there ran shallow but cool, whispering against the stones. She set a basket on the bank, slipped off her boots, and waded in until the hem of her skirt darkened. When the sun caught the water just right, her reflection broke and reformed with each ripple. Jedediah sat nearby, skipping stones, pretending not to watch. Then the sunlight shifted, and the wet cloth clung to her calves, outlining thin white scars beneath, faint but unmistakable. He turned away instinctively, then looked back. "Someone rough you?" he asked, voice low. Sarah traced a hand over the surface of the creek. "Someone tried," she said. No more than that. Her tone carried no plea for pity, only finality, like a door quietly closing. He wanted to say something, anything, but words felt clumsy. So he didn't. His silence, rough-edged but steady, filled the space between them. Somehow, it was enough. Later that week, the sky turned white with heat. Jedediah climbed the roof to patch a loose shingle, shoulder stiff from an old break. Sarah came out with a bucket of nails, shaded her eyes, and called up, "Your turn." He almost asked what she meant. Then he saw her waiting, and he understood. He told her about the ravine, the fall that shattered his shoulder, the brother who'd hauled him out only to die of fever days later, how the guilt had worked its way into him like a splinter he could never dig free. His words came slow, halting, each one scraped from years of silence. When he finished, the sun was dropping, the light turning amber along the fence line. Sarah rested a hand on the ladder, steadying it for him as he climbed down. "Then we're both still mending," she said quietly. He looked at her a long moment and nodded. The wind picked up again, soft and cool, stirring the cottonwood leaves like a sigh of relief. July 1883. That summer the heat turned mean. The grass cracked underfoot, and the air shimmered as if the whole world were holding its breath. By dusk, thunderheads piled high to the north, swollen and dark, promising relief or ruin. Nobody could tell which. Jedediah was in the yard when the first strike came. A sound like the sky tearing in half, followed by the hiss of fire catching dry hay. Within seconds, orange light bloomed behind the barn doors. "Sarah!" he shouted, sprinting toward it. The barn was a furnace before he reached it. Flames climbed fast through the loft hay, greedy and alive. Sarah appeared beside him, a wet cloth tied around her mouth, her skirts already smeared with ash. "Bucket line," she called, grabbing the pail he'd dropped. They worked shoulder to shoulder, moving in a rhythm born of desperation. Smoke scalded their lungs, sparks bit their skin. Jedediah's muscles burned, but he kept going, hurling water where the fire was thickest. Then he smelled it, burnt hair. He turned and saw Sarah's kerchief alight. Without thinking, he caught her by the shoulders and beat out the flames with his bare hands. The pain didn't register until afterward. "Are you hurt?" she asked, coughing hard. "Not if you keep moving," he rasped. But before they could fill another bucket, a beam gave way overhead with a deep groan. The world went red and hot. When the dust cleared, Jedediah lay pinned, his leg trapped beneath the smoking timber. Sarah didn't scream. She dropped to her knees, seized a fence rail, and wedged it beneath the beam. Her face was streaked black, her eyes fierce. "Don't you dare leave me," she said. Not a plea, but a command. And with one guttural cry, she heaved. The wood shifted, groaned, then rolled free enough for him to drag his leg clear. They stumbled outside together, coughing, clutching each other's arms. The barn's frame collapsed in on itself with a sound like the end of the world. They fell to the ground, gasping, side by side in the ash. By dawn, only the stone foundation remained, glowing faintly in the first light. Smoke drifted east across the prairie. Jedediah's hands were blistered, Sarah's voice raw, but they didn't move apart. Her head rested against his shoulder, his arm around her. The fire had taken the barn, but something else had burned clean between them, every unspoken wall reduced to ash.